Intelligence Unit, Sepi Golzari-Munro, and Extinction Rebellion activist and co-founder of the COP26 Climate Action Plan, Chidi Oti Obehara. Good to see you both. And of course, one of the big issues are these climate pledges. China announcing details of its emission reduction plans. Saudi Arabia saying it's going to go net zero by 2060. But, I mean, Sepi, is this really too little too late? We're talking decades in the future.
Thanks, Stephen. I'd say, honestly, it's never too late. Every fraction of a degree matters, as the science tells us. And, you know, as a former diplomat has put it, this is not a cup final. We're not looking for someone to come out of these talks to wave a piece of paper and say we've solved climate change. These talks are there to generate the political pressure for action. And to a degree, you know, it's working. The fact that Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, that spent the best part of a few decades undermining the climate process, now feels enough political pressure to come to the table on net zero, that's progress.
Yeah, I mean, there are some positive signs, Chidi, but even Boris Johnson has said today it is very, very far from clear that we will get the progress we need.
Thank you. That's a valid point for Boris to make. There are no insurance policies that make sure we get exactly what we want. However, the fact that the Saudis, who are building Nob, you know, a solar city supposed to be completed by 2025, the fact that the Saudis, who have a 600 million ton per annum CO2 carbon footprint, the fact that the Saudis, who were determined, absolutely, to maintain the fossil fuel era for as long as they possibly could, are now pledging that they will sort of actually get to a point by 2030 where they cut their methane output by 30%, where they draw out a plan so that by 2060 they are net zero. All of these are great starting points for us to continue to talk to the Saudis. And just as a minor aside, while we've watched global politicians dance around the issue of net zero, I think that Prince Charles's position of being able to convince an alternative monarchy in the Middle East, with its challenges, to actually change its course from backing its national industry champion, Aramco, to turning around and saying that they will look at alternative diversification for their economy. I think these are wins. I think this is to be celebrated.
Okay, but I mean, what always strikes me with all of this, Sepi, is as you both pointed out that the good steps forward that are being made, but there is always there's a lot of rhetoric involved here, and the action is always much slower in coming. And I mean, even the £1 billion pledge that was meant to be, you know, beginning to be met last year has now been pushed back to 2023. The action never follows the rhetoric as quickly as we want it to, does it?
Certainly not as quickly as the science says it should, and that's a fact. You know, developed countries have had 12 years to come up with this 100 billion per year, and, you know, whilst they suggest that they'll be able to meet it from 2023, and average, 100 billion over the next 5 years, it's yet to see whether that will be enough for developing countries.
I mean, it's interesting in all of this, Sepi, Chadi, with all the problems that arise when we look at the international commitments through all of this. The Secretary General has said that, you know, the needed changes are economically affordable and technically possible. There is no time to lose. Now, when we hear those sort of words, to say it is technically possible and economically viable, that leaves us with very little excuse. We need to put much more pressure on somehow, don't we?
100%. I mean, to even narrow it more firmly, the UN Secretary General called this a code red year after the IPCC's WG1 report came out just a couple of months ago. We know for a fact that there is a capacity in countries across the OECD to make very rapid changes, to decarbonize very quickly. What we're seeing is that there are obvious roadblocks to change that happen at national government level, which is why this particular year, where we have COP26 coming to Britain, and this particular year where local city-level initiatives are starting, this is a year where real change can be made. And this is a year where, if we do pay attention, even after COP27, if we have to, we can carry on putting pressure on governments at local and activist levels in a way that remind them of their obligations and their duty of care they have towards their citizens.
OK, well, talking of change, actually, petrol prices have hit a record high, up 28 pence a litre in the last year. Now, guys, that sounds pretty bad for the motorists, and we all need to get about. But is there a positive in all of this? Is this going to push people away from fossil fuels and onto electric vehicles perhaps more quickly? Sepi, what do you think?
The first thing I'd say on this is that it's yet another blow in the rising cost of living being experienced by the UK public. And it comes really quickly off the back of this year's gas price hikes, seeing wholesale gas prices at record highs. And, we have to look at what, these things have in common. And again, it's highlighting the fact that the British public and industries are vulnerable to these volatile and increasingly expensive fossil fuels. So it does highlight the urgency to help the public transition away from fossil fuels. And one positive announcement in that regard was actually last week's net zero strategy, where the government announced a zero emissions vehicle mandate, which is requiring manufacturers to sell an increasing percentage of zero emissions vehicles each year, possibly from 2024. And that will help actually drive down the costs of reductions sooner so that ordinary households can afford them. Just a quick point on that is that actually we're looking at EVs being cheaper to buy than petrol and diesel in about 5 years' time, and that's purely through plummeting tech and manufacturing costs.
Yeah, well, and that is going to be important because there's a big price gap at the moment, isn't there, Chidi? But this new survey says 24% of people buying a new car in the next year say they intend to buy electric or hybrid. Perhaps you could say it's not enough, but it's a big chunk of people.
It is, and the policy that stops new diesel cars being sold in 2030 is a really important policy. But what we realize from sort of the academic studies is that the price elasticity of petrol isn't that high in the short term. So when the price of petrol goes up, people can't quickly and immediately switch. They need more important structural things like an encouragement of the government to fund a good car scrappage scheme and to enable electric and hybrid vehicles to become dominant on our streets. So, of course, today in London is the launch of the ULEZ scheme, which Mayor Khan Sadiq Khan has lauded as a good way of getting a lot of diesel and petrol cars off the road, and we very firmly support that. The one thing I would add is that when you look at the marketplace as it exists now, we're looking at the way that all fossil fuels across the energy value chain impact everyone. It isn't just motorists, it's also utility companies that are suffering terrible damage from increasingly volatile oil and gas markets. So transition for the public is not just about transport, it's about energy as a whole. It's about our utilities, it's about transport, it's about our manufacturing, it's about reorganizing society in a way that makes things better for everyone.
We're out of time, but Chidi, Sepi, good to see you both. Thank you. Do stay with us. More coming up.